There is no way to have a Russia that is secure and to have Russian neighbors that are secure. And the Americans have already chosen to ally with most of the neighbors, even before the Ukraine war started. Let me start by saying that this war is nowhere near over. The Russians have not fully mobilized. The first phases of the war, they only had 100,000 troops in theater. They have 8 million men aged 20 to 30 that can potentially be drafted. They have only to this point drafted about 300,000. From the Russian point of view, the only thing that would be worse than not launching this war in the first place would be to launch it and fail, to pay all the prices for the conflict but not get what they were after, which is a more securable when mud season is over. So two things will have changed. Number one, the Ukrainians will have had the entire winter to deferred maintenance on all that Russian gear that they've captured, and they'll be bringing new hardware in from the West. At the same time, the Russians will probably have at least another 500,000 men that they've thrown into the war. Keep in mind that when this war started, you already had several percentage of Ukraine's territory that was already under Russian occupation from the last war.
Crimea.
Yeah, Crimea, the Donbass. This is the 7th time that Putin has done this since 1999 in the former Soviet world. He's going to keep pushing until he gets to an outer perimeter that he thinks is more securable. Russian territory is just really poor economically. It's some of the poorest land in the world for anything. And they've never had enough money to generate a road network. So what they do is they expand out until they reach zones that they can defend. So the question was never, will the Russians stop before they get all of Ukraine? No. It's like, what will they go for after they've taken all of Ukraine? Ukraine had said that as of January of this year, and you can see how seriously the Russians took it. Anytime people are talking about security guarantees for the Russians, you know that they've bought into the Russian propaganda. There's a lot of details that have to be worked out between today and then, because obviously first they have to beat the Ukrainians. I can't predict where the war is going to go. The first year of every Russian war looks just like this one. It's a shit show. And then the Russians throw 1 million men at it and the math changes. We haven't had that change yet. Until such time that the Russians can regain the strategic initiative, and it's possible that they won't, their best play is to make Ukraine utterly uninhabitable. This is their last real conventional war. They only have those 8 million men of the appropriate age, and if they are fighting or dying, they are not having kids. And Russia is already the second worst demographic structure in the world after China. The first 7 times that he did things like this, the world handed him exactly what he was after. This is the first time that people have pushed back. Russia dissolves in the first half of this century if it loses the war, and in the second half of this century if it wins. There's a lot of examples. The Russians will probably disassociate into 30 or 35 warring principalities, become not so much a no man's land, but a shifting feudal conflict zone. When the Ukraine war started and the sanctions kicked in, especially the financial sanctions, and the Russians lost all their euro, gold, and dollars that were stationed abroad, they then bought nearly $500 billion of yuan assets and were like thumbing their nose to the United States. See, we got other options. And then the day came that they needed to cash in some of those yuan assets to do things, and the Chinese no, that's all right. We don't want them back. And the Chinese discovered that they just lost $500 billion. So the Russians are just quietly now going back to euros and dollars on the black market because it's more reliable than dealing with the Chinese.
The best case scenario is we get something a little bit like what happened after Mao left in China, like a gang of 4 from the different factions who rules as a committee, and then one of the 4 offs the other 3, and then he's in charge. That's kind of the best case scenario now. I think it'd be more likely that Putin has so removed everyone of leadership talent that we're probably going to have more of an organizational collapse. Igor Sechin of Rosneft, that's the state oil company, is probably the most capable who's left, but everyone else of the 150 KGB members that are left so thoroughly hate him in all things that it's really doubtful that he'd be able to rally anyone to his flag. So there really is no one. The KGB's successor, the FSB, has been in charge of ever since. Now, Putin is obviously from that crowd, but so has everyone around him. Alexei Miller of Gazprom is probably the best example, but the chiefs of all of the major companies that they're called the Siligarchs, the security oligarchs, that have taken over chunks of the Russian economy in large bites ever since 1999. They are all personally beholden to Putin. They are all from that inner circle, and they are all over 50. So there is not a generation waiting in the wings that has been trained. Putin has been very effective at pruning any potential challengers to his rule. So he will be the last capable, competent, president of the Russian Federation. He's already 70. In the 1980s, especially after 1983, the Russians were facing a simultaneous strategic and financial crunch. And the only way they could make the strategic picture work was by having some sort of peace with the United States. They had outspent themselves for 30 years. And so they were flat broke. And because you don't just go from, that is my ideological foe, that's the country that's been threatening me with nuclear weapons for 50 years, to, yeah, we can talk now. You don't do that in a year. It took two premiers dying of old age before they could finally make that offer. So in the meantime, they just tried to spend their way out of their strategic imbroglio, and it didn't work. It bankrupted them. And so they had to figure out where to cut. Well, they couldn't cut the military because they weren't really ready to make peace. They couldn't cut the nuclear facilities because they weren't ready to make peace. They couldn't cut their oil and natural gas production because that was their only source of income. So they cut education. In Russia, the educational system is different from here. So here, you go to high school, you go to college, maybe you go to grad school, you enter the workforce, and you're earning money from day one, hopefully. But in Russia, there is a technical training that was done in their high schools that is not done in the United States as a rule. And then you become an apprentice. And you have an apprenticeship for 4, 5, 6 years before you go on and get your grown-up job of being an accountant or an engineer or whatever it happened to be. Well, the high school technical training collapsed around 1985. That's when all these cuts happened, just as Gorbachev was coming to power, which meant that there was no one that could be taken as an apprentice right out of high school. You would have to train them up additionally. And so the labor force got very thin, and the educational system was never repaired. And then you had the post-Soviet collapse where pretty much everything was canceled. And you fast forward to now, and the youngest group of people who have had that technical training and had a good apprenticeship and actually had a real adult job, they're in their late 50s. And it's far too late at this point to regenerate that. They've tried a couple of times with hiccups here and there. It's never really stuck because it was never for more than a small subsector like software coding or a very specific group of people like friends of Putin's kids. And as long as that's been the situation, you're not getting the millions of new workers that are skilled that you need every single year. 2 million workers also moved out in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. They were all young and they were all skilled. And we've probably had about 250,000 Russians flee so far during the Ukraine war, which again, were young and skilled, and they were absolutely irreplaceable. So, you fast forward just a year, 3, and we're talking about the Russians having to make some very real choices about what to let drop. Oil and natural gas, food production, the military component, the strategic missile forces. They can't keep all of these things up and running. And I don't want to overanalyze this because we just don't have very good information. We're only in week 3 of the war.
Right.
There's a case to be made that their military commanders are something they decided to let drop, in which case that was probably the wrong thing at this time. But we've seen an Iraqi level of military coordination and logistics in the war so far. It's abysmal. It's underperformed what every analyst I have spoken with has ever guessed the Russians were capable of.